Well, hello to you. This is Tom Berry. This is week 2, chapter 3 and 4 is what we're going to be talking about all kinds of fun stuff, culture, language, different aspects of culture, and then sort of looking at all of that from a sociological perspective. So follow along with the worksheet. I think the worksheets will help you prepare for the midterm exam, help you just kind of process information that's in these videos as well. Just making sure you get the the main perspective, the main ideas for the content. Excuse me. All right, now back, here we go. So let's kind of walk through a couple different things. In the PowerPoint, you'll see all these key terms, like the first slide, key terms. You're more than welcome to go through all those and define them. I think it can be helpful to do that. Just to provide definitions, but not necessarily required. They can help you in terms of preparation for the midterm exam. We'll go through a lot of these terms as we kind of go through, but not necessarily all of them. So maybe after the lecture, go back over and see which ones are kind of missing that we haven't defined, and then just go back and define them. All right, so what are we going to get at here? So the looking at culture is really fascinating, right? So we swim in culture, but we're not aware of it. So the beliefs that we develop, the values that we have, our practices, our behavior, are immersed in culture. I mean, it's what humans do, like, right? So we are within a context, whether culture thinking of a national context, like of a nation or a particular region within a nation, or thinking about historical time period. Culture is moving. Sometimes it moves faster than other times. We assimilate and develop ideas that are related to culture, right? So kind of like a sociological investigation of culture is that culture shapes the way that we think, the way that we respond, both individually as groups and then also as a nation. So a study of culture is important to understanding a lot of things that are going on in society itself. So what are we talking about? We're talking about culture. Well, it's language, the beliefs that we have, values, traditions, practices, the stories we tell, the mythologies that we have. I mean, that's all kind of stuff that's related to culture. Culture is something that is learned. We're not, we're born without culture, right? So we develop ways of thinking, knowing, and doing that are, accumulated over a course of time. Sometimes we develop ways of thinking, knowing, and doing that are in a very conscious way, that we're learning things. But I would argue that probably most of what we learn is actually unconscious, that we just assimilate ideas from society itself. And this will become kind of clear, some examples that we'll provide as we kind of work through and thinking about culture. I mean, one of them I put here is, if you think about, well, what are the markers for a successful life for someone living in the United States in this year? So how do we think about success, right? So how do we define that? There's a cultural component to that, right? There's a gendered component to that. How males and females may respond to that may be different. That may be shaped by class position, how individuals respond to what is a successful life. And that could change course based on, whether somebody's in an Eastern-based society, a Western-based society, modern, pre-modern. I mean, what does it mean to have a successful life? And it's really important, right, to think about how culture shapes that idea of success, that we become maybe, if there's a dominant cultural idea about success, then we're in that culture that's, providing this idea about success, and then we have to figure out how to navigate that, whether we follow that pathway or create our own ideas about success, so, but the point is that we are living in an idea in a world that's defined success in very particular ways. We're swimming in this water, as David Foster Wallace in a commencement speech talked about, sort of this idea about swimming in water, right? That the fish, morning boys, how's the water? The two young fish swam on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other one and says, what the hell is water? They're in it all the time and they don't even know it, right? And so how do we think about things, right? Culture. Here's some different examples of culture I just kind of put together, just kind of to kind of get at some of these different ideas. The practices, this is an image from practices that we develop, our behaviors, class, gender become important, race becomes important. This is 1950s probably, this idea of what is etiquette, folkways, kind of the norms for proper, improper etiquette, social etiquette. Folkways change across time, right? This idea of holding up a door, sort of this male chivalry sort of thing of what is expected within society itself. 1960s, 1970s Black Power movement. I've been seeing a resurgence with the Black Lives Matter movement, but the powerful sort of symbology, we look at the world of symbols when we're looking at culture, what is the meaning that's attributed to those symbols, how different groups may assign different meaning to those symbols, what those symbols do for groups. It's a way of expressing identity, expressing values and beliefs and ideas, ways ways for pushing up against society itself. You could be thinking about historical time period, thinking about culture, dress, fashion, appearance, language, as well as music and the arts. This is sort of an example about thinking about globalization of culture, cultural diffusion, how culture moves across place, and this idea of like white skin in different countries around the world, like there's a status associated with that the whiter the skin, that there's more prominence or more status associated with that. So products that are developed within the beauty industry to respond to that. And also the beauty industry kind of creating that idea as well. So this idea of whitening creams. So that scratching on that a little bit or thinking about that brings us into all kinds of questions of where does that idea of whiteness come from? How does it sort of get transmitted across culture, time, and place? And a lot of different things like that. And then we can think about the food that we eat, right? Spam, 1950s, 60s spam, ham in a can. And sort of there's the glory days of spam, I think we're back in that time period, these sort of, I don't know, foods, you can situate them in time and place. We can think about them in that way. Okay, so we can break down culture in two different ways. Think about material culture, so physical objects. The example of G.I. Joe all the way until the 1990s was, sort of a normal dude. His biceps, if you made him life size, were about 16 inches. They're, fairly average in terms of a male. Made the representations in G.I. Joes and action figures have become what we talk about as hypermasculine. They become really this sort of behemoth, impossible sort of form to be able to accomplish, right? So what has happened? Like why, this material study of material culture gets us into being able to examine changes in material culture. Where do they come from? Why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So material culture, studying them is a way of studying society and changes that are going on in society itself. Chuck Taylor shoes, Michael Jordans, these are the first Michael Jordans, so the physical objects that we wear. This is an example of the long time, this is probably I'm gonna guess 1970s, pretty common. So instead of having hand dryers in the bathroom, they had this towel, a rotating towel, which I thought was always kind of gross because people, you dry your hand and then you pull down. And Lord, I don't even know how often they changed that towel in a bathroom, but it just kind of rotated. It really wouldn't clean itself as it rotated, but it was sort of that was kind of the way of doing hand drying at that particular point in time. Even looking at physical objects like, prophylactics or condoms, interesting about the way it's marketed. The language that we could look at in terms of marketing is really interesting. We could look at things like the beverage can, and little changes, like before there was a pop top, you actually used a bottle can opener. That was before, and then there's sort of these different evolutions or different steps in the process of developing different things that are going on top of a can. So I don't know, there's a story behind that. Males, white males, and sort of the idea of wearing a wig, like, okay, where does that come from, right? Where does that come from? Historical relic, all these different kind of things. Here's a couple, just a couple different examples. It's really interesting to me, like this idea of straight white teeth and the power or the status that we associate with straight white teeth. I mean, it's an American culture thing as far as straight teeth and white teeth, but it's kind of also becoming more prevalent in different countries as well. So we start to think about, parts of material culture, consumer items, the ways in which consumer items shape ideas that we have about beauty, about self. We see ourselves within culture in different ways. We can look at this idea of straight white teeth. There's also a racial component to this. If you type in straight white teeth or products for white teeth and you do that in your Google search, my guess is you're going to see predominantly, if you look at images, most of the advertising and marketing is to white females predominantly. So there's kind of like an issue going on there in terms of race and gender as well. You can look at something like where's trash around the world? Who produces the most trash? I think this is sort of a relationship also to mass consumption. So anyway, just as sort of another example, illustration, and we can think about culture. We also can think about, that's all the material kind of culture stuff, right? So material culture, physical objects, the food that we eat, fashion, clothes, even physical objects, probably say, I don't know, holding up, like the Black Power, peace sign, those gestures, probably non-material culture. So I'd probably put that in a different location now that I think about it a little bit more. But now it's kind of move into, away from that physical objects, the material culture, to the non-material culture. And I use this example here about speeding tickets. And so I kind of back up for a second. So culture, again, we swim in it, but we don't even know it, right? So we develop beliefs and ideas about things. And then we sometimes fail to remember that these things were learned. Culture is learned. We're socialized into culture. Oftentimes it's unconscious. We just develop ideas, right? It could be that at times that when our beliefs are challenged in a way, we defend them without really fully understanding those beliefs themselves, or what other beliefs might be, different ways of thinking about the social world. So sometimes we get threatened, or we view things in a more threatening way versus trying to be open and understanding of like, okay, where do those ideas of culture come from? How do we think about them? Let's be aware of them so we can become more empowered to drive culture in different ways, or think about culture from a more analytical, more conscious, more aware perspective. It puts us in a better position to be more self-empowered, and then empowered in terms of more collectively. So the idea, so we're going to go into this non-material culture, beliefs, values, ideas that we have. Those are all non-material. So ideas of fairness, what is fair, right? And I would then sort of provide a perspective here that ideas of fairness are learned. We're not born with an idea of fairness. We learn ideas of what is fair and what is not fair, right? And again, we swim in the culture, so we're not even aware that we're developing particular ideas of fairness. So let's look at a specific example and bring this back to that idea. A speeding ticket, why have a fine associated with a speeding ticket? Well, the fine should be a deterrent, right? So it should be a deterrent for future behavior. So a deterrent for speeding, right? So if one person made $100,000 a year and one person made $50,000 a year, but they both get the same fine for driving the same speed in the same speed zone area, it would seem like, from a more analytical, rational viewpoint, that it's not serving as an equal deterrent. That the person actually who's making a lot more money, it's less of a deterrent than the person who's making less money. That there's an inequity going on there, or there's an imbalance going on there in some way. In our culture, our way of thinking about fairness is that same fine for everyone is fair. In Finland, and not only in Finland, but other European countries as well, the fine is commensurate with income bracket. So you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, and the officer asks you for your ID. You provide the officer your ID. The officer slides your ID through a scanner. Your income bracket comes up, and your fine is based on your income bracket. That's for the Finns and for Norwegians. In England, they do this as well. Switzerland, they do this as well. They do this in different countries. That's their concept of fair. That if you made a lot more money, it seems like that it's not unfair, it's equitable. that your fine is based on your income bracket. From our American viewpoint, this is Fox News, a more conservative viewpoint, that Fox News, identifies something like this as socialist. And I find that fascinating. Like, where does that come from? That sort of a reaction to something like the speeding ticket. I would say there's not one right or wrong way of assigning speeding ticket, but there's different ways based on different cultural ways of thinking and knowing. And sometimes we get this sort of, it's interesting, the reaction when a different cultural framework is provided, in this case, thinking about fairness in a different way. There's some who respond in a very, in this idea that it's a strong reaction because it's pushing up against kind of cultural values kind of thing. So that's one example, non-material culture. Another one of them, and it's going to come up in class a lot throughout the course of the term, this idea of rugged individualism. That this is a very American sort of idea. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps is the idea, right? So you are accountable for your own success. You are accountable for your own failure. And it puts us in a position where we have a hard time recognizing the individuals or groups within a context. If a person is rich, they got themselves there. If they're poor, they put themselves there. I mean, it's very American and think it's tied into a lot of history behind that, of our frontier culture, self-made individual. I mean, there's a lot of history behind that we won't go into here, but there's, those ideas that we have, some of our cultural values are deeply entrenched in our institutions and the stories we tell, the ways that we kind of approach the world. So culture is really powerful in that regard. And you can read this sort of thing about sort of why that rugged individualist perspective is faulty. Because what we do is we look at something like poverty, or we look at different social issues, and we look at it through the lens of sort of this rugged individualistic perspective. And when we do that, we do not take into consideration or do not provide proper weight to the influence of social context on human behavior. And then it leads us into all kinds of different social policies that are really not, they're really harmful or not helpful in solving the particular social issue or social problem. So that becomes problematic in a lot of different ways. But part of examining culture, I think sociologically, is so we're aware of culture, aware of our values and beliefs, we're aware of our ways of thinking and knowing and doing. So we can become more empowered to shape culture in ways that are represent the interest of more, of society itself. Okay, so this is an important chart. These two researchers have been collecting information and data on cultural values across nations over a period of time. And it's been really interesting to sort of watch how these values have shifted across country. Going back, I think they started doing their work maybe in the 1980s, maybe 1970s. So 50 years of data, and looking at sort of how these values of traditional values versus secular values. So here on this axis, so traditional versus secular science, empirical ways of knowing, moving away from religious order, ways of knowing and thinking, and then more tradition bound. Survival, based on everyday trying to acquire resources, everyday life, everyday survival, less focused on self-expression, but more about making it. So survival, less economically developed countries are more focused on their values towards survival. More economically developed countries tend to, place value on self-expression. So what I want you to note here is that, Protestant, so religion, cultural value of religion, had a huge influence on the development of capitalism. And we see this in terms of cultural values, both in terms of self-expression and ideas of the secular world. So even though the Protestantism is a religious-based, it's a religion, Protestantism, that it embraced ideas of science and technology in ways that other religions did not. So much more focused on increasing secular life or engaging in science and technology. So I guess what I was trying to indicate here is that if we look at, where's the United States? Let me pause for a second. Let me pause for a second. All right, here we go. So if we look at the United States, here's the United States, and here's a lot of other European countries, right? So self-expression is actually really more highly valued in a lot of other developed countries, Eastern, Western European countries. Also, they're much more, more secular in orientation, and we have the sort of, we have kind of bound by tradition more so. This is why possibly explains things such as climate change, right? So climate change science and the skepticism that exists in the United States about the science behind climate change, or we could look at the coronavirus and science behind understanding virus and transmission of virus. In a more secular-based society, and probably one that has more trust towards science, trust towards science and government, that influences, those values influence the way in which people think about these kind of things. We could look at, spiritual freedom. I like this idea of spiritual freedom, that places where they are economically developed, so countries that are more developed, have more spiritual freedom. And by spiritual freedom, meaning having the ability to basic needs taken care of. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basic needs being taken care of, and being able to develop the self and having sort of be more self-empowered to develop the self. It's harder to do when you're focused on, survival, right? These kind of things. So context matters. You can watch this video. I'm not going to share this video now, but it's really interesting if you could look at basically certain gestures, certain behaviors, certain greetings, right? So how greetings change across time and place, kissing on one cheek versus both cheeks, shaking a hand. I mean, all kinds of cultural different ways of something as common as a greeting. The ways that we eat food, eating with our hands, eating with utensils, eating with a knife. I have a friend, eating even things like pizza or salad or other food with a knife. Had a friend of mine from Brazil, went to go visit him years ago. And, while knowing him and then also visiting him, a lot of individuals in Brazil use a knife, regardless of what they're eating. It's like very culturally specific in terms of behavior. And then we can sort of think about the sounds that people make. I always find this interesting, like the sound of a dog, right? And how different cultures make the sound of a dog bark, woof, woof, or all these different ways of making these sounds. And part of it may be related to the language system of that culture, different ways in which different cultures pick up on language and sounds. It's really funny and interesting and entertaining and informative. So check that out. Culture, we can see it like even in, this is an example of thinking about Central Oregon or Oregon, where we don't have self-serve gas. Only, recently in smaller communities, self-service gas is okay. You can basically pump your own gas, but in most other places, you have a gas station attendant to pump gas for you. I was traveling in Idaho years ago with my son. We were on a bike trip, and went to Fred Meyer gas station, and I kept on waiting. Just like, oh man, it's like, what's going on? How come they're not coming over to fill up my tank with gas? And this was about 11 o'clock at night or something like that. And there was someone who was kind of working in the area, an attendant. They were sweeping the area, cleaning it up, and I kept on going, well, how come they're not coming over here helping out? And then it took a little while. I was a little slow and figured out, oh, we're not in Oregon anymore. I just kind of forgot sort of where we were in terms of culture. Another thing to kind of think about, and this is kind of important, is that the ideal culture, what we idealize, what we mythologize, what we desire, what we want, what we kind of uphold as sort of the ideal is different than what we practice, right? So in every country, it's that way. There's no country where there's a perfect alignment between what is ideal and what is practice. What's interesting and valuable to look at is the distance between ideal and practice culture, and how that's expressed around different things. So if you look at social mobility, the ability, the degree to which individuals, regardless of class position they're born into, can move to a different class. There's the ideal, the American ideal that everybody is socially mobile, right? That you can just, if you work hard enough, you can get to where you want to be. So that's the ideal, but then there's the practice culture. So what the question is how far is that distance between the ideal and the practice culture? And then also the issue of how does that ideal, the impact of that idealization, that ideal culture. So if we have a situation where there's a great distance between the ideal and the practice, what does it say for the, for looking at income inequality, for example? If the ideal is that anyone can make it, but yet we have structural things that are going on that provide privilege and disadvantage for different groups, what does that do for us? How does that shape our ability to see that particular issue of income inequality? How does it shape things like our own individual thoughts and ideas about income inequality, as well as social policies to address them? So that's kind of the idea of like why study and look at ideal versus practice culture. Here's a chart of thinking about equality versus equity, this sort of idea that we talk about more and more. So equality is that everybody gets the same box, right? Regardless of height, that's equality. That's kind of like that idea, that speeding ticket, an American, the idea of equality is everybody gets the same thing. But the same thing isn't really equity. So equity addresses people's starting point, the place in life, their lot in life, of providing things that are more equitable to providing more equal or equitable opportunity. So in this case, it's like, okay, well, this shorter person to see the game would actually need to have a couple boxes. That's actually more equitable. And then finally, like, why do we even have the boxes or the fence at all, right? So make it an even playing field for everyone. I'm reading a book right now. It's kind of really interesting. It's called The Nordic Theory of Everything. And her perspective is that in Norway and other Nordic countries, that they're much more free, in part because they're free because society is set up to be more equitable for more people. It's not a social, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, those aren't socialist countries. Those are democratic socialist countries. They're strong, they're capitalist countries. They engage in capitalism. They're supporters of the free market or of market-based economies. But they've figured out a way to create the sort of idea that things are more equitable, that's more shared kind of thing. That's kind of their culture, right? I don't think we can necessarily adopt their culture. Our history is different. So as we kind of, anyway, just different cultures, different places. We can think about something like this. Okay, incomes are rising at the top. If you look over a course of time, the bottom 10% has basically remained relatively stagnant. And the cost of living in terms of housing, transportation, higher education, all those different kind of things have changed. So if we're stuck in our cultural ways of thinking, right, that the idealized cultural idea that if you just work hard enough, you can get there, we're going to run into a problem. Because if society is growing in a way that's providing less opportunity to do that, we're going to get some serious pressure points. And we're going to create policies or a lack of policies to address these kind of issues. And that's another reason why it's important to sort of look at it. Voting is important. The ability, access to voting. We had the Voting Rights Act that was established in early 1960s. I think it was 63 was the Voting Rights Act, and 64, the Civil Rights Act. And those were, those acts were put into place in order to help facilitate greater access to voting, because there was a lot of history in terms of voter exclusion, excluding people from the right to vote. So the ideas of suffrage, the ability to vote, and we still deal with that today, right? So we have this, we idealize this sort of idea about democracy. Everybody has a voice, everybody has the ability to vote, but then we have the practice culture. So we got to deal with that. We got to deal like, that kind of that tension between what's idealized and what's practiced. We talk about it less today, but back in the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of focus on family values. But I always thought it was interesting that this talk of family values, but rugged individualism at the same time. And there seemed to always be, for me, like a contradiction between these two different things. We are the only nation that does not have, only nation in the industrialized world that does not have paid maternity leave or paternity leave. We are the outlier. So we talk about that idealized culture of being a culture that's supportive of family, yet our policies don't always represent that. Even things like our minimum wage. I mean, you can't live, it's not a family-based wage. You could be working, one person, or if it's a two-person family household, working a minimum wage jobs. If you made minimum wage job, or even at $12 an hour, you're making $25,000 a year. Two people making $12 an hour is $50,000 a year. I mean, starts to raise questions, and that's before taxes. Start raising the question about, well, how is it, the challenges with that in a way. And there are other examples of culture as well, thinking about idealized versus, these are idealizations. It's sort of about the body, the male body, the female body, sort of what we idealize about sort of then what's sort of the practice culture. And you can see, we can kind of get into a lot of different tension points where if we idealize certain ideas of femininity or masculinity, but the ways in which people actually live their lives are different. It can impact us in very detrimental ways. So being aware of that's really important. I think a couple questions to ask is what distinguishing between ideal and practice, what does it tell us? How does it inform us? What is the value in doing that? It helps us to understand, the degree of distance between the two, helps us understand how we are responding to social issues, social problems. The more we're able to distinguish and understand, the more we're empowered to bridge that gap between the idealized culture and the practice culture. The more we're empowered to address the realities of the practice culture versus being trapped in a mythology and not willing to engage in the way that the world's actually practiced. This is an interesting book I read a couple years ago, Kurt Anderson's book, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire. And basically the argument is American culture is kind of set up. And when we have Hollywood, right, production of storytelling, we have industries that are all about, these sort of production of these stories that are idealizing culture in very powerful ways. We have a long history going back to early colonization and fast, moving forward of mythology of rugged individualism. So we have a lot of idealized culture about the individual. We believe in the fantasy world. We have Disneyland, right? So we believe in the fantasy world of the way things could be. So it's a good thing about being optimistic. I mean, that's a good thing, and be optimistic. But blind optimism and optimism that prevents us from looking at reality is very problematic. I mean, for me, look, as a social scientist, it's like, well, we got to look at reality in order to address reality. If we're caught up in the fantasy world and that's the place where we want to live, it's really not helping us understand the day-to-day life of how society operates or how individuals are experiencing the world. And it prevents us from actually doing things that may be more helpful. So there's a thing about rose-colored glasses, right? So we see the world through rose-colored glasses, but if you look at the world through rose-colored glasses alone, you can't see the red flags. So the red prevents us from seeing the problems. So, optimism is good. Blind optimism may be problematic. Okay, here's some other ideas. Cultural diffusion is the process of spreading culture. The Great Migration of Blacks moving out, the African Americans moving out of the South during World War I, World War II, mass migration, the Great Migration is what historians call it. And with them brought music. I mean, the blues, Chicago blues, St. Louis, Kansas City blues, each of those different communities, different blues. Follow music is always interesting. There's cultural diffusion with music. Looking at rap and hip hop, East Coast, got started in America, got started in the East Coast, and then diffused to the West Coast, and then developed the different sensibilities of West Coast and East Coast culture, shaping the way that which hip hop and rap developed. This is the Gem Theater. This is Kansas City, St. Louis blues. This is basically the Great Migration, African Americans moving different places. Where did they move? So story to tell and looking at things like cultural diffusion. We could think about things like, okay, cultural diffusion. Cultural leveling is the idea that things become more homogenous, more alike, more similar. Imperialism is where a country is dominating another. It's like an imperialization. They're taking over culture. So with globalization, countries that are in position with a lot of power are moving their commodities, their franchises, their corporations, And not only their products, but ideas behind them, the values behind them. So for some, it's not just diffusion, but it's actually domination and control. And that's the imperialism kind of component. So look at things like Starbucks, like, Starbucks moving to different places around the world, started in the United States. Look at all the different countries where Starbucks has been diffused. It's also kind of, sometimes Starbucks, the way it operates, it's still, the core part of Starbucks is still there, but reflecting the local culture as well. This is kind of more of a cultural imperialistic look that the United States, America is wrapping itself around the world, that its culture and its values. Think about globalization of beauty, for example, and beauty products or Hollywood. It's not just the product, it's the values and the ideals that are behind and underneath and within these products that are moving around the world. So here's another example about different products sort of that are being diffused. And it could be like, I'm focusing here on corporations and products, but it could be behaviors, could be language, could be all kinds of different things that are going on. Years ago, we took a family trip. My extended family went to Hawaii. Been there many times. My dad loved going to Hawaii, so we went there quite a bit as a kid and growing up. And anyway, we got off the plane. My brother said, "Wow, we could be anywhere USA right now because you got off the plane. There's Costco, there's Starbucks, there's Blockbuster, and it's like, oh yeah, it's strip malls, so I don't know, culture changes, right? We can see this in Central Oregon. As Central Oregon is getting bigger and bigger, there's sort of this interplay between trying to preserve local culture and then the expansion of big box stores and corporate stores, just sort of transnational corporations and stores. So it's this sort of culture is changing and shifting. Okay, last concept of culture is the idea of hegemony. And hegemony is an idea from Antonio Gramsci, and he was a Marxist during the time of the rise of fascism in Europe, in Italy and specifically. And he had this idea about the control of culture is how you control population, and that individuals in society, that we become the carriers of culture. Hegemony is the idea that the dominant ideology of society, the dominant beliefs, the dominant values that reflect the interest of the ruling class. So going back to that speeding ticket, well, it's the same fine for everyone. I would argue, or Gramsci would argue, that idea represents ruling class interest, but we get socialized into it. We support that ideology. We, meaning not the non-ruling class, support that ideology and then reinforce that ideology. We defend that ideology, right? So you bring up that question about the speeding ticket, and my guess would be that a certain percent of people are going to react to the idea of actually the speeding ticket should be commensurate with income bracket. Well, Gramsci would argue if you're defending maintaining the same fee for everyone, that maintenance of that is coming from the general population or segment of the general population. That's a way that reinforces the status quo, reinforces ruling class interests. And so the question or the issue that Gramsci is raising, it's not that the ruling class are controlling necessarily, they are in part, but rather the general population has also developed ideologies that are actually reinforcing the system itself, protecting the system. And ideology or cultural beliefs that represent sort of ruling class interest. So this is the idea for Gramsci and hegemony. So the different examples, Aunt Jemima, so this representation, visual representation, increasingly seen as very problematic. This is Aunt Jemima prior to, I think this was 1980s when they changed the appearance of Aunt Jemima. People started to raise questions about the racism behind these representations. So the company shifted to this sort of more modern, contemporary Aunt Jemima, but there's still problems in that. There's still racist components to these particular representations. So we swim in culture, we accommodate, develop ideas that were assimilate ideas in culture, and sometimes we develop ideas that are representing the ruling class interest or reinforce ruling class interest. There's all kinds of stuff about gender and hegemonic ideas of gender, masculinity and femininity, along with that. How we think about income inequality, right? Is an issue that's a lot of hegemony behind that. Believing that everyone has a chance to be successful, and if you're not successful, it's your own fault. I mean, that idea and that ideology reinforces the ruling class interest. We're going to talk about this in class, but we think about one aspect of culture is thinking about how we mark status. Status is social position. So if you looked at, okay, well, how do we mark social position with each other? Every country does this. So we can understand how we mark position as an examination of basically of culture itself. So I don't know, this is just one example, thinking about how would we rank different coffees? Is there a status associated with even, this material culture, the objects, what we consume? Is there a status associated with that? Status and thinking about occupations. There's been a lot of work over the course of years, a Harris study poll going back, I think the 1970s, they started doing this, looking at different, since 1977, what occupations had the most prestige, which occupations have the least amount of prestige. And things change over a course of time, but how do we think about status? Another thing about thinking about culture is looking at language, the symbolic world, language, symbols, and understanding sort of the meaning behind them. So let's kind of talk about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is basically two researchers, Benjamin Whorf, and I can't remember Sapir's first name, but basically had this idea that language determines your perspective of reality. So you view the world through a lens of language, right? And that language during their time period, they talked about as linguistic determinism. We talk about it today as more like linguistic relativism, that like language shapes your perspective of reality. Language reinforces it, but does not determine your view of reality. So language and culture are interactive. If we study our language system, we're studying culture, right? I was reading a book, hold on one second. Interesting book called A Curious History of Sex, written by a historian looking at different sexual practices and looking at the history of sex from pre-modern to modern day society, very Western sort of view. But interesting thing about the language of losing virginity, a person losing their virginity. Well, okay, when does that language come about? That language is very specific to females. We don't talk about males of losing their virginity. It's usually a language that's associated with females. So if we understand language, we can understand culture, right? And then we see the world through that lens of language, right? So when we hear we look at the world through that lens of language. And this will we'll see this as we kind of go further here. I'll put a handout in Blackboard on a list of words that you can see that I just kind of put together, how language and culture are interactive. Thinking about certain words such as, what's the word? Oh, I think a powerful one for me is the word shy. Right. And so shy, from our cultural framework, that somebody who is vocal, somebody who verbalizes a lot, somebody who's talkative, like those are things that we value. And so somebody who's pretty quiet is sometimes perceived as being shy, where they may not be shy at all. They just don't speak as much. I was in graduate school, my master's in social work program. Near the end of the term, one of my peers said to another peer, she said, "Why are you so shy?" And this other student said, "It's not that I'm shy, it's that I'm not afraid to be quiet." And I was like, wow, what a powerful demonstration of language, right? So this one person seeing this person who is not talking much through a language of shy, deficit, and the other student saying, whoa, it's not that I'm shy, it's not that I'm not afraid to be quiet. So language, how we describe others, how we describe the social world, and how we describe ourselves are really powerful. And they all take place within culture, right? So thinking about individuals who've committed a felony, what's the language? somebody who's an ex-convict, an ex-felon. I mean, language is powerful, right? Language is a way of shaping meaning. Then there's this idea of social construction of reality, and this will come up different points in the term. But basically, the idea that Berger and Luckman put together is that, that humans create reality or create meaning. Objects don't have meaning, but humans give them meaning. And that we view the world through the constructions, through the ways of organizing thought. We view the world through that lens. So in some ways, like, okay, social construction of ideas of sexuality. I mean, sexuality and ideas of sexuality change across time and place. Humans are constructing them. The question is, well, how are humans constructing them? Who's constructing them? And what are the impacts? I mean, those are some questions thinking about social construction. Some constructs are fairly stable, that most people agree to them. Most people share the meaning. Other things that are much more contested, much more contested, and they can change. Ideas, constructions can change, right? People, sometimes we're not aware, if we're swimming in culture, we're not aware of how reality's been constructed. And then we start to, sometimes there's a move towards deconstructing, understanding how things have been constructed, and then deconstructing in order to rebuild and develop different ideas. So language is a core part of how we make, central part how we make meaning. Meanings become institutionalized and also become socialized into us, right? So then it becomes normalized, and it becomes a way to viewed as the only way to view reality, or the dominant way, or the stable, or the cultural way of thinking and knowing. And we got to remember that meaning is arbitrary. So the meaning that we assign things like race, it's arbitrary. And we'll talk about this later on the term, but race is not a biological, race is not determined by biology or shaped by, I mean, there's biological component, but race and how we think about race is a social construct at its core. It's arbitrary, so there's no logic to it necessarily. It's arbitrary, it moves and changes, but it's real, because that's how we see it. So that's the tricky part of social construction stuff, that it's arbitrary, but it's also real because that's how people see it, and that's how we've constructed the world. So different examples of that. So social construction of alcohol and drugs. I mean, alcohol, going back to the time of Benjamin Franklin, there's the creature of God, the good creature of God, that beer was in part because drinking alcohol is probably much more safe than drinking water at that time period in cities. But you go to the sort of, okay, well, how do we get to prohibition? Well, you got to construct a different idea about alcohol. Prohibition, part of the idea of prohibition was, the belief that alcohol was causing crime and delinquency and causing serious social problems. And there's some cultural things going on here at the same time. There's a lot of things that are happening that are shaping that construction of alcohol. We can think about marijuana, right? We think about marijuana as well, and kind of go down that pathway. Think about marijuana. And there was a time period, of course, where marijuana wasn't constructed as anything. It was just, it was a substance. Different indigenous communities didn't see it in terms of a moral position, in terms of thinking about marijuana. But it was in the 1930s, and from the American viewpoint, it was 1937. The Harry Anslinger formed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and started this campaign on marijuana as sort of the killer weed. And there is a connection to race with this, with Mexican laborers, and this idea that usually our drug wars in the United States there's a class issue and there's a race issue with them. We're constructing these ideas of the drug, and then we develop policies, to respond to these social constructions. So that's pretty powerful, right? So during these time periods, of the marijuana menace, this idea of the killer weed, there was a belief that, that smoking weed would cause wild orgies, people to go insane, people to kill each other, that it's a gateway drug. The next thing if you smoke a joint, you're gonna be doing heroin next. I mean, all these different kind of things that were going on. Fear, 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 fear. You have fear, then what do? You develop a Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So you give power to the state in order to sort of develop policies to criminalize people who are using these substances. I mean, pretty powerful if we look at social construction. And then fast forward, look at where we're at today. It's like, well, that's been really interesting kind of ride to think about the war on drugs that started in the 1980s. And then now we're at the place where legalization of marijuana in a lot of states, you know, it's like, wow, what a different construction of marijuana, right? So here's a quote just about marijuana from Harry Anslinger, a couple different quotes. I mean, you can just read the racism within this stuff. Read the idea about things about responding to ideas of fears of communism during that particular time period. I mean, it's pretty powerful, right? The racism that's sort of behind sort of some of this stuff. 1980s and the crack scare of the 1980s. There's been a lot of work on sort of so Gary Webb, who was I think it was the San Jose Press, did a lot of work of uncovering the involvement of the CIA in basically bringing cocaine to inner cities and bringing cocaine to America during a particular time period, stuff that was going on in terms of Nicaragua and the United States. So anyway, the history going on there, but there's this crack scare that started to develop in the 1980s, which led to the war on drugs. And it's really powerful, right? So during this time period, there are those in academia, sociologists were critical of this idea of this kind of crack scare idea that we were misplacing, we're misunderstanding the public health problem that was going on in terms of crack with crack and powder cocaine. But because of the way politicians and the media and the general community engaged in this idea of crack scare, it led to serious and long-term consequential social policies, longer sentencing, mass incarceration of individuals for drug offenses. So if we don't pay attention, the ways in which problems or social problems get constructed can lead to huge impacts on society, not only to individuals who are caught up in these kind of systems, but huge problems, economic, social problems that become consequences of this stuff. If we're not aware, we just get prone to sort of doing things that could be very detrimental and very harmful in a lot of ways. So this is powder cocaine during the drug scare of the 1980s. One of the policies was, one of the sentencing guidelines or determinant sentencing, that if a person had, the idea was a person had a certain amount of possession in their possession, they got a certain charge regardless of the circumstances. So your sentence was determined. There's actually a book that coded what your sentence would be. And the idea was it was 500 to 5 was the ratio. If you had 500 grams of powder cocaine, you got the same sentence as 5 grams of crack cocaine. So it became the 100 to 1 ratio kind of thing. So it's like the question, like, well, why? Well, why that difference between the two different substances? And eventually that law or that sentencing guideline became challenged, questioned, and removed, because raising questions about the racism that's built within that, the classism that's built within that, powder cocaine, white middle class, crack cocaine, inner city. So there's a disparity between sentencing. Methamphetamines, 1990s. I mean, all kinds of different stuff. I mean, in that time period, I remember very well trying to, this ways in which the media were constructing these ideas about methamphetamines. If we look over here, it wasn't that meth was not a problem, but if we look at really what the larger objective problems are, we have, got some larger objective problems that we're not willing to deal with, or we've accepted in a way. And what this does too is, by sort of assigning this sort of demonizing and getting this sort of moral positions about these drugs, it moves us further away of seeing things as a public health problem. We see it as a criminal justice problem. So it's a different construction of reality. If we compare these things to like the opioid crisis that started in the 2000s, there's been a lot of work on sort of understanding that part of our social construction of the opioid problem, these are white communities. And because they're white communities, we've responded more of a public health issue. I mean, that's one part of that. I think there's differences between the drugs or between one, opioid started with, pharmaceutical industries and different ways in which people access the drug. But there is, I think a case to be made. There's class and race-based issues that are shaping the constructions of reality. We're not going to spend the time watching this right here, right now, but I encourage you to watch this. Really interesting on even fonts, right? If you look at fonts, we associate meaning with font and typeface. So interesting. Then here's just some different examples. Typeface. You could probably go through different kind of these, like this is IBM, right? This is Skype, Facebook. I mean, that's not it. But if you really just had that font and remove the color, put it a different color, people would be able to tell. I mean, font, right? Assign meaning to font. Different things, social construction, body hair, females or males, in this case, females and body hair. It wasn't until basically the 1900s where this idea of women and shaving, well, I mean, actually that practice goes back to ancient Egypt, but new technologies, new ways of promoting ideas about female beauty and shaving one's legs, arms, different parts of the body. There's January, just sort of this thing of time period for women to not shave, it's like women not shaving as a pushing up against sort of these dominant cultural ways of thinking about body hair. This is you can look it up. It's probably this. I don't know if I don't have it linked here. A prickly subject. Aeon is the website, AEON. You can probably type that up. It's just sort of a short video on basically a woman talking about her experience of not shaving and talking about her body. And it gets to that idea that, social construction of the body, social construction of hair, all those different kind of things. Okay, so let's move in a little bit different direction. So we kind of covered sort of culture, language, social construction of reality. Now we can talk about the development of the self and different ideas about the development of self. So we have a couple different theories or perspectives about the self. We have Charles Cooley and George Herbert Mead. Okay, so in both cases, sort of getting at that, both Cooley and Mead, that we develop a self by being immersed around others. Without being immersed around others in society, we can't develop a self. Cooley his language was society and self are twin born, or the self and society are twin born. The self cannot emerge until the self is part of society itself. So, I mean, that's the only way. That's just a human process, right? We develop by being around individuals. We develop a sense of who we are by understanding ourselves in relationship to others. So Cooley and Mead provided theories of looking at how we develop sort of ideas of self. Okay, and these are just some different kind of pictures to kind of get at some of the different ideas. Masculinity, ideas of masculinity and how we learn these kind of different kind of things, part of self-development. Body and sort of body image, self-development, right? How we compare ourselves to others. The roles that we play, even the young kids playing roles, playing doctor, these are rudimentary ways in which we start to develop ideas about self. This is sort of like looking at even going down a toy store aisle and seeing things like the boy aisle, the girl aisle, the colors, the types of toys. And these are like learning ideas about gender. Short little video here of Riley, it went viral years ago, and she's protesting about why are all these items for girls, why are they basically pink and purple? She wants something different. She is a little girl, she recognizes like, well, there's some stuff going on here. So Cooley and Mead, let me see if I have a chart on that. Okay, so Cooley is the looking glass self. Actually, hold on one second here. Let me see. Okay, so I guess we're going to talk about Cooley a little bit, Cooley and Mead a little bit to differentiate between the two. So Cooley is the looking glass self, looking glass. So we see ourselves through the way that we imagine others see us. And the others could be, people that we know, people that we come in contact with, people just in our physical surrounding, people we don't know. It could be things like, the mass media shaping our looking glass self. It's the way that we imagine how others see us and judge us, right? Humans are social creatures, right? We are social creatures. So we are influenced and shaped by our perspective, our perceptions of how others see us. So you can start to see one of the fundamental problems here, or one of the issues that comes up, our perceptions of how we believe other people see and judge us. So our perceptions may be accurate or inaccurate, right? So then it raises the questions, what's shaping our perceptions of how other people see us? I mean, I think the body stuff can get really interesting in terms of looking glass self. In this case of looking at, a female sees herself as being much, even though she's really thin, she sees herself as being really large, right? So where does she develop that particular idea? That was something that was learned within culture and environment and context. And her perception that she's developed has come from social interactions in the social world, images that she's from mass media, from culture itself, idealization within culture, the status that's associated with things. So that's kind of the idea for Cooley, is that the self and society are twin born. We develop ideas that shape the way that we think about ourselves based on how we think others are seeing us and judging us. Mead has a different sort of viewpoint on development. For me, there's these different stages of development, and I won't go through all of them, but basically the basic process is that his idea is that we think before we act, and we think about either a specific other, so people like, your mother, your father, significant other, a friend, a coworker. You take the perspective of other. So we take the perspective of other, imagine how other people might think about something, and that shapes what our actions. So we think before we act. So I'm out somewhere, I don't know, and trying to think of an example. I'm out somewhere, no one else is drinking a beverage, or everybody's drinking, everybody's drinking a beer, and I go, I think I'm gonna have a glass of wine instead. So Mead would say, part of what we've learned over the course of time, social learning, he's a behaviorist, everything's learned. So he's thinking that my decision of what to do, my action is based on how I'm thinking others are going to respond to that. So I'm thinking, okay, what are my people around me? What are they going to say? It's not that what people around me determine what I do, but they shape and potentially influence what I do. So it's not deterministic. It's just because other people, I take the role of other and think, okay, everybody's going to look at me and go, man, Barry, why aren't you drinking a beer? You're drinking wine. I think about that. I still may buy the glass of wine instead, but I've gone through this process. I'm taking the perspective of others, how others may see me or see that decision, and then I respond. So there's the specific other, and then there's the generalized other. The generalized other is the idea of taking the role of society or larger groups. So that becomes important, right? So if we think before we act, we're making decisions. What career pathway should I choose? What educational pathway should I choose? Should I go to college? Should I not go to college? I mean, all these different kind of things. There are a lot of stuff of exercises in thinking before we make decisions, thinking about not only what certain individuals that I know may consider, but also societal expectations. So Mead gets us into that kind of stuff a little bit easier. And then there's dramaturgy, Goffman's idea of dramaturgy, that the world is a stage. We are players on that stage. It's this very Shakespearean idea of self, that everyone is engaged in impression management. That's what we do. There's an old Billy Joel song called The Stranger, these masks that we wear. And we all wear masks to some degree. We all have uniforms to some degree. We all have scripts that we follow to some degree. So dramaturgy is getting into how we actually perform, how we manage impressions, how we engage in terms of the theatrical performance of the self. So here's a couple different examples, looking at, to be a member of a gang, there's a lot of dramaturgy going on here. Looking at tattoos, body posture, demeanor. And you can say the same thing as somebody who's a lawyer, somebody who's a doctor. I mean, myself as a professor, right? There's some dramaturgical kind of components to that. The doctor's office, right? The stage of the doctor's office. So think about things as a setting, a stage. Think about the actor as a performer. Think about the performers performing for an audience, right? So that becomes an issue going on here. It's just we perform for the audience. So who's the audience? I mean, these gang members are performing for each other, performing for other people who are not members of the gang. So it's a fundamental part of Goffman is that we are engaged in role performance, the setting, the stage, sometimes dramaturgy. When we're performing a role like a Jamba Juice, there's a script that's given to us, right? As a customer service worker, this is emotional labor, right? As a worker at a place like Jamba Juice, Jamba, and ordering something at Jamba Juice. I mean, that's like a script that you follow, how you greet people. I mean, it's this script, right? That's very coordinated, orchestrated, non-organic, not natural, very corporate in terms of that. But that's the role performance that's being required of a person working in that particular position. But it's an emotionally exhausting because it can go against what somebody actually wants to say and do, right? But it's about managing impressions for managing impression. So remember a white supremacist group, dramaturgy. Man, there's a lot of dramaturgy going on there, without a doubt. Performing for members of one's own group, performing for other members. There's masculine and feminine ways of engaging in these performances. Short little video, the first date, if you want to check it out, kind of interesting. We can think about the self and looking at solitary confinement as being kind of an issue, or looking at, the self removed from society creates problems. There's been studies like feral children who are socialized away from human contact, and how that basically leads to a breakdown of the self. You can't develop, it leads to pathology, it leads to serious psychiatric issues and problems. I mean, potentially, there's a trend in that regard. There's a correlation between that, between removal from human contact and a breakdown of the self. COVID and impact of COVID, people becoming more socially isolated, and the impact in terms of mental health. I mean, that's a normal human reaction to not having that human contact. And I think the ideas of Cooley become really important, of Mead. We develop ideas of who we are based on our interactions with others, and we're not having those face-to-face interactions. Even like Zoom-based interactions can fulfill part of that, but it's not the same as being in a physical context and an environment and developing the self. So again, Cooley, society and self are interactive, same for Mead. There's an interaction between the two. You remove the individual from society, put them in solitary confinement. You can check out this video about that. And you can start to raise the question, and we can see why solitary confinement is very detrimental public policy. It's actually very harmful to the individual. It's non-constructive in terms of any idea about rehabilitation. And here's a good way of thinking about Cooley. I imagine your mind, and especially what your mind thinks about my mind. So my perception, the way I imagine that you think about me, and what your mind thinks about what my mind thinks about your mind, right? And this is like the complexities that Cooley's going after. The way I imagine, not only the way you're thinking about me, but the way that your mind thinks about my mind, thinking about your mind, right? It's like, whoa, man, there's a lot of stuff going on there, thinking about how we're developing ideas about self. And there's some just different information about solitary confinement that's been demonstrated, research on the implications of that. We could go back and think about, tie together a couple different things. Going back to last week's sociological imagination, and think about, why is it that America, the United States, we developed solitary confinement? I mean, going back to our early prison settings, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia was one of penance and solitary confinement. Very American approach. So it's an examination, it's sociological imagination is understanding social forces, understanding history, culture, the impact of history and culture on society itself, moving away from an individual kind of examination to a cultural, social examination. So that's the idea of the sociological imagination, right? Looking at things that have not the private trouble, but the public issue, looking at the broader patterns in society, looking at the larger social context. Look at solitary confinement. You could look at that. I guess I never thought about it before. We could look at it as both non-material culture, the beliefs and values that are shaping material culture, the development of the physical architecture of a prison, right? That's material culture. Architecture is physical culture. So non-material culture interacting with material culture, historical, political context is really important. I could even bring in hegemony here, thinking about that Americans may support solitary confinement, but that idea of supporting solitary confinement for Gramsci is reinforcing ruling class interests. The question is how? You know, and the argument I would make, or the case of thinking about with Gramsci, is that if these ideas of supermax prisons and solitary confinement, it's a response to the dehumanization of people who've committed crime, that we don't see them as being human anymore. And rather than working on the underlying social issues and conditions of which are creating, influencing, shaping crime patterns, we demonize the individual. So that protects the system from changing. That's very hegemonic. We could think about functionalism, that prisons as a way of regulating and control for creating stability in society. And that's the function of prison. There's the conflict at theory application that prisons are, in solitary confinement, are reinforcing class, race, other inequities in society and reinforcing ruling class interests. I think solitary confinement is a really interesting example, and the death penalty becomes another one, or capital punishment. Is we swim in culture, we defend culture sometimes without understanding sort of where all that stuff comes from. And everything appears maybe natural to us or inevitable and necessary. And we participate in reinforcing this culture sometimes without becoming more reflective and understanding the history behind things, why things are the way that they are. So be more empowered is the idea, right? Become more informed, to be able more conscious and aware of why things are the way they are, the way that they are, so we can be more in a position to change. Okay, that final point is that sometimes there's this sort of thing that, especially around gender, race, maybe even class, that's just how people are, that's their nature, or how certain groups, well, males are just that way, or females are just that way, or you know, there's race and biological arguments about race. Well, you know, or class and survival of the fittest. You know, that's just what humans are, right? Right. So struggle for survival is because humans are naturally competitive, whatever that stuff may be, right? So we talk about it. There's problems with that nature side of things. Nature is part of who we are, but nature doesn't determine who we are. Culture shapes the expression of nature. Culture shapes what is honored and respected and valued about nature. Culture shapes how we think about nature. So nature doesn't determine reality. So the reason for this is that sometimes we can get into biological determinism. So it's very nature that biology determines a person's lot in life or determines particular things. Males are better at math, just naturally. This is sort of a biologically determinist viewpoint. The reality is that that's not true. I mean, the evidence is that, man, that's a total cultural thing going on there about math and acquisition of math, you know, of strength in math, mathematical aptitude. Is there some nature component to processing of information, neurological development? Absolutely. But those differences and what we see in terms of mathematical aptitude are expressions of culture, not nature. So if we essentialize it and say it's biological, it removes any responsibility of the cultural and social environment, and it justifies any inequity. It's like, well, that's just the way it is because nature's decided that's the way that it is. So you can't change things, right? If it's nature, you can't change it. Hegemony again, right? So biological ideas sometimes, or this idea of nature, is very much problematic, and it also reinforces the status quo. This idea about race, specific races of being more athletic, biologically determined to be more athletic. There's a long history in terms of biological ideas about race that are reinforcing that, and it's social cultural. It's not races are not biological, number one, and number two, the sort of idea of biological determination and race are reinforcing particular racist ideas within society itself. Evolutionary ideas about survival of the fittest, everyone for themselves, this idea that that's how humans are, Darwin, provide the viewpoint that it's through cooperation that for sure there's competition within social units. It's not that the competition doesn't exist, but human communities survive based on cooperation. Cooperation is much more is much more powerful in terms of survival of the community, survival of the species, survival of the individual. It's cooperation. But we as a culture picked up on this idea of survival of the fittest, right? And there's a lot of history to that we won't kind of get into. And the last example here of looking at the sort of nation master thing, the example of looking at sometimes the belief that, well, males are just naturally more aggressive. It's testosterone. This is mythology. This is not true. This is a belief that's been developed. It's faulty conclusions. It's not that there's no difference between testosterone levels of males and females, but the argument that it's testosterone that's driving that is faulty. The driving in terms of aggressive behavior. This is just one example to sort of illustrate this. Okay, look at the number of rapes, of recorded rapes, look at it around the world. And you get kind of some issues maybe in terms of reporting in different countries, but if you look at things like assault rates, look at even thinking about it without even knowing the data, you could look at, okay, what's the likelihood of assaulting somebody else based on your social class position? Somebody who's in the top 1% versus in the top 10% versus the bottom 10%. Well, there's going to be a relationship there. People of the higher class are going to be less likely to engage in assaultive behavior. There's something going on there that it's not nature, it's culture that's shaping, it's context that's shaping. Ideas of nature are not the ones that are driving that. So when we see nature, it justifies inequality, simplifies something that's much more complex between individual and society. Here's some different time periods and different issues that we've gotten that were problematic in the past, that were built on this sort of biological determinist nature sort of stuff. So eugenics, eugenics, eugenics. The idea of meaning good genes. This is like Hitler. People think about Hitler, Nazi Germany, eugenics. I mean, for sure, going on there. These were science out of the United States that were developing ideas of eugenics. Better, stronger societies through stronger gene pool. And here's sort of just some charts on that. People were actually at county fairs, taking their kids to the county fair to see if they had good genes, and being the idea. And this got us into, there's race and class issues that are sort of embedded in this. It was an explanation for, it's genes that are responsible for poverty and crime and delinquency and degeneracy. So if we clean up the gene pool, we'll have a better society. I mean, think about the problem of that kind of argument, that it's a genetic level kind of thing where it denies any social cultural context, justifies inequality, reinforces those kind of things. There's race components, gender components, class components to all that different kind of stuff that's going on there. During the war on drugs, super predator, the language, look at superior warp hypothesis, language. Super predator is a sort of idea, right? It's almost like it's biologically that kids in the inner city in the 1980s and 1990s, this language that politicians were throwing around, that these are super predators. I mean, it's very Darwinistic and very biological nature orientation in terms of they're super predators. They will kill without any remorse. And that led to policies about basically treating youth as adults and locking them up for longer periods of time and demonizing sort of, there's again, race and class issues that are associated with that. And then finally, another thing to sort of think about, looking at, okay, who's pursuing engineering degrees or whatever kind of degrees, distributions are male, female. We could sort of look at that and go, oh yeah, well, that's biological, that's nature. Whoa, whoa, whoa. There may be a gender difference going on there, but that's not nature, that's culture, that's context. That's all kinds of different things going on there. All right, that's a lot of great content. Hopefully that was valuable, informative. If you have any questions, let me know. enjoy the rest of your day.